Hello. Thanks for joining us today as we look to share the basic information you'll need to know to make an application for the Minnesota Highway Freight Program. My name is Robert Clarkson. I'm a transportation planner in the Office of Freight and Commercial Vehicle Operations at MnDOT. In OFCVO, I coordinate the Minnesota Highway Freight Program along with other freight planning activities. I'm joined by Michael Blank, another transportation planner in our office, who I'm working with to develop the fourth round of the MHFP solicitation.
As for today's agenda, we will discuss the program information that will give you some context for the current round of a solicitation, and then delve into the application itself, review the subject matter it contains, and then provide some details on the scoring criteria that has been developed to go along with this application. If you were an applicant for the MHFP in the previous round in 2023, you will probably note a lot of similarities, but there are a few changes we will talk about in today's presentation. So let's get right into the information about the program, starting with some information regarding the purpose of the program. The Minnesota Highway Freight Program, or what we oftentimes call the MHFP, is a statewide competitive solicitation designed to improve the state's freight transportation system. The program accomplishes this goal by funding projects that improve freight transportation in several key categories, including freight safety, freight mobility, first and last mile connections, and access to intermodal freight facilities. To help us with selecting projects, we rely on the project application information you submit, in addition to an evaluation committee of subject matter experts. The applications are qualitative and quantitative measures of a project's relative benefit to the Minnesota freight system. Funding for the program comes from the Federal National Highway Freight Program and State Trunk Highway dollars. In this round solicitation, approximately $51 million in program funds will be available for freight improvements that address the investment goals identified in the state freight plan. The funding amounts to roughly $25.6 million per state fiscal years 2029 and 2030. We have recently updated our program website to include information important to key stakeholder groups that may wish to make an application for funding. The website includes an updated description of the program, an updated application for the fourth round, the evaluation criteria, and contact information, including the email address you will need to submit your application. We will discuss program updates later in the presentation.
Like the previous solicitations, we will develop a program of projects to be implemented over the 2-year window for this solicitation. One change with the current round of the solicitation is that funding from each program year cannot be flexed across fiscal years as it had been in the past. So while we have $52 million roughly overall, the funds apportioned for 2029 cannot be awarded to projects in 2030 and vice versa. There is also a match requirement. The Minnesota Highway Freight Program may fund up to 80% of eligible project costs for a project. Applicants will need to identify the other funds for a project through local or state match via some other public or private source of funds to support the additional costs of the project. Projects on the interstate system may receive up to 90% of the eligible project costs through the MHFP as in years past. The pie chart on this slide shows our draft or target investment direction. These numbers are not absolute, rather they are targets designed to help us understand and communicate investment priorities as we develop the solicitation. The intermodal improvements target will remain at a maximum of 20%. We have adjusted the target window for the other targets. First and last mile connections and the safety target have been adjusted up a little to 20 to 35%, while the freight mobility target has been decreased a little to 10 to 30%. The changes in the targets reflect our expectations related to the impact of greenhouse gas legislation on the program, which will be discussed later in the presentation. The application process is designed to be rather straightforward. We are conducting a single solicitation for both of the program years with a maximum award of $10 million. This is to ensure the distribution of program proceeds on a statewide basis rather than giving all of the money to a single project. The program can fund both new construction projects as well as existing projects. If you are adding scope to an existing project, you just need to clearly convey the freight benefit of the added scope items in your application in order to take advantage of the MHFP funds. In addition to this program, we'll also be putting together an interactive webinar on July 23rd that will feature a Q&A session to support your assembly of your applications. The due date for the solicitation is Wednesday, September 3rd at 11:59 p.m. Please submit your application via the email address on the slide, freightplans.dot@state.mn.us. MnDOT will evaluate applications this winter and announce the awards in the spring of 2026. We will also get into the specific eligibility requirements for certain projects and applications later in the presentation. Eligible applicants. There are a variety of eligible applicants on the statewide freight system that can apply to the program, including state and local governments, MnDOT districts, metropolitan planning organizations, tribal nation governments, port authorities, railroads, and airports. Eligible activities. The FHWA includes an extensive list of eligible program activities. We are highlighting a few of those here as they are described in the application. For this round of the solicitation, MnDOT will field expressions of interest for freight transportation plans or studies, in addition to the projects listed here on the slide. Interested parties should submit an email containing the name of the project, an estimated amount, and a general summary of the scope of work to MnDOT staff. To give some context for project eligibility, we can look back to projects from the third round. In 2023, the program funds available were only a quarter of the total funding amount requested via the applications we received. Due to the strong interest in the program and a desire to fund projects that are ready for construction, the Freight Investment Committee has directed us to restrict funding for certain activities, including preliminary engineering and utility improvements from the eligible project list for the Highway Freight Program. Those activities are not permissible. Intermodal projects. As with the previous solicitation, we are encouraging applications for MHFP funds that create opportunities for intermodal freight improvements. We have the ability to program up to 30% of the MHFP dollars in this solicitation for intermodal freight or freight rail projects that may connect two or more modes of transportation as part of the intermodal project category. There's some specific guidance in the law regarding how we fund intermodal projects that includes eligible projects are those within the boundaries of public or private freight rail or water facilities, including ports, which provide surface transportation infrastructure necessary to facilitate direct intermodal interchange, transfer, and access into or out of the facility. This is probably best explained by saying that these are projects that can be connected to the highway system indirectly via an improvement to a railroad, a port, or a waterway or airport that provides some measurable freight benefit. Critical urban and rural freight corridor designations. The Minnesota Highway Freight Program funds projects that provide freight benefits on the interstate system or when located on a designated critical freight corridor. MnDOT has the discretion to designate and reassign critical corridors in order to support the program or in some cases where a project may not exist on a corridor already. In the next slide, we have a map that shows the current MHFP with the existing critical urban and rural freight corridors. And I'll scroll to that. So this is the map of the Minnesota Highway Freight System as it is currently, as well as the associated critical urban and rural freight corridors. As we look at this slide, there are a couple things that may help you understand what's on the map. After project selection, MnDOT works with the FHWA to update the critical corridor designations pursuant to state statutory mileage limits. Now on this slide, the interstate system shows up in red. Critical urban freight corridors are shown in purple. Critical rural freight corridors are shown in green. And previous projects selected in earlier rounds of the highway freight program are shown with the gray construction worker symbol. This is also the same map that appears in the recent updates to the state freight plan. For projects in the Twin Cities metro area, there are a few other considerations. Freight safety and mobility projects in the Twin Cities area may be eligible for highway freight program funds if they are located on one of the 3 tiers of truck corridors identified in the Met Council's truck corridor study. You can access the Council's truck corridor website via the link at the bottom of this page. The other metro area project with specific location requirements consists of interchange and interchange ramp projects. In the 7-county metropolitan area, applications for these projects must demonstrate successful completion of the preliminary interchange approval process described in Appendix F of the Regional Transportation Policy Plan. You can learn more about Appendix F of the TPP on the Met Council's website. Here's a picture of the document so you can see what it looks like. The TPP and the appendix are well established in statute, so we aren't going to spend additional time on them here. But if you have questions about how they may relate to a potential MHFP application, please contact me for assistance. Both interchanges and highway capacity or roadway lane expansion projects are also subject to new requirements passed by the state legislature in 2023, which took effect in February of 2025, related to greenhouse gas emission reductions. We also discuss these on an upcoming slide. Regarding coordination with tribal nations, any project that is on tribal lands or may be found to have an impact on tribal lands due to proximity must coordinate with a tribal nation that may be impacted by that project. Tribal lands are not always shown as reservations, so care should be taken to identify these locations. If you have any questions about this in developing your application, please consult with MnDOT's Office of Tribal Affairs. Regarding coordination with metropolitan planning organizations, any project located within or proximate to an MPO boundary must coordinate with the respective MPO in that area. By coordination, we mean that you should provide a letter of support from the MPO office that summarizes and acknowledges your project, as MnDOT will be checking with MPO staff to ensure this step has been completed. So next we'll switch into talking about the application details themselves and criteria for scoring. First, we'll talk about roadway projects, as there's 2 different types of scoring elements within the program. And so I'd like to move into talking a little about scoring the roadway applications. This table might be familiar if you submitted a roadway application previously. It explains the criteria as shown in the application. The far left column on the chart are the freight criteria. This column notes each criteria a project will be scored on. To the right of that is a main measure column that explains what each criteria is measuring. On the right side of the chart, you'll see 3 separate roadway category columns for scoring the projects. When you fill out your application, you will check if your project is either a safety, mobility, or a first and last mile project. You'll only choose one of those that best applies to your project type. When we score your project, we'll only use the scores in the column on the right side that is relevant to your project. Each of the project categories have slightly different point allotments available for the given criteria, but any application, regardless of which of the 3 categories it is within, can obtain up to a maximum of 1,100 points. Now this is the scoring criteria for the intermodal project side of the application. This is also the same as the table we had in the previous 3rd round of the solicitation. No changes were made, we just included it to show you what the current scoring criteria parameters for this side of the application look like. To reiterate, the purpose of the intermodal project category is to fund any projects that interconnect 2 or more modes of transportation, such as highways, railroads, ports, waterways, or airports. Greenhouse gas emissions target integration. With the passage of the greenhouse gas legislation in 2023, the state adopted new greenhouse gas and VMT, vehicle miles traveled, reduction regulations. As enacted, the new state law requires highway capacity expansion projects to complete a GHG impact assessment and conform to GHG and vehicle miles traveled reduction targets before it being included in the state's Transportation Improvement Program, or STIP, or any Metropolitan Transportation Improvement Program, or TIP. MnDOT is required to follow this statute as we implement our various programming, including the Highway Freight Program. The most likely scenario is that a project in the mobility category, such as or especially a major highway expansion project that results in the addition of a lane of over a half mile long, will need to meet the GHG emissions requirements in order to qualify for funding through the MHFP program. In such case, the applicant will need to demonstrate that the project is exempt from the GHG legislation by submission of an MHFP application. This slide is a summary of the information in the application that you'll see when you look it over. A complete application will include all the information shown here. Applicants will need to provide a written response to the questions and submission requirements in the application. The final document you submit should consist of a cover sheet, responses to the application questions in either the roadway or the intermodal project category, one or the other, maps to demonstrate the location of your project, and conceptual sketches or schematic plans to communicate what you're doing. A resolution of support from the Metropolitan Planning Organization or roadway owner, where those may be applicable, confirmation from the Met Council or tribal communities related to projects that are located within their geographies. Finally, applicants are encouraged to keep the application materials to 35 pages total. Applicants may choose to provide a short summary of additional documentation for brevity's sake. Documentation beyond 35 pages will be reviewed at the discretion of MnDOT staff. Which brings us to the end of this presentation. Any questions for us about the Minnesota Highway Freight Program can be answered via emails to staff, myself, Robert Clarkson, at the freight planning email address on the slide. We are also planning a live interactive webinar intended to cover application details and questions that may arise as you work to put your application, responses, and documentation together. That will take place on July 23rd. Additional details will be added to the MHFP program website about that meeting in the future, including details for how to join the interactive meeting session. If you have other questions in the meantime, please connect to us via email. Thank you.